All right, in this chapter, we're going to talk about labor market discrimination. Let's first look at some empirical data. So in the top graph here, we go back to 1973 and forward to approximately the present, 2015, 2016. And we're looking at the female to male wage ratio. Note that it's been growing over time. So back in 1973, females made around 60% or 65% of what males make, and it's growing to now around 80%. That data does support that women make a fraction of what men make. That could be a result of many factors, one of which is discrimination. The second graph shows the same time frame, but African American to white wage rate. And that gap has not really increased. It's stayed around 80% over the long run. Again, that implies that blacks make a fraction of what whites make. There's many factors that could contribute to that. Discrimination is one of those potential factors. As we go into this chapter, we're going to see how discrimination reveals itself in the marketplace and how that can create wage differentials between different groups. We're going to be using some classic discriminated groups like blacks and women. That does not, however, imply that those are the only groups that have suffered from discrimination or will suffer from discrimination in the future. Many groups can be exposed to this, so don't misunderstand. Even though we're using females and blacks as kind of the template to illustrate the model of discrimination, it is a universal template that can apply to any group that is discriminated against. Look at the unemployment data here. In the previous graph, we were talking about wages, right, where we see differentials. But unemployment is another factor. Getting a job, right? So if you go back to 1972, you'll notice that whites were around 5%, and it breaks it down to female and male, but just think of whites for a moment, around 5%, and blacks were around 10, 12%. And for the most part, over time, we've seen that whites have made or have had a lower unemployment rate than blacks. Another thing that you'll notice is that white females and white males, even though there's differences in unemployment across time, they generally are around the same rate, okay? With some periods where females have higher unemployment than white males, and white males have higher unemployment than females, but pretty closely connected. Whereas with blacks, the African American females tend to have higher or lower unemployment across time than African American males. And this is a little bit difficult to read, but the males are the checkered graph. So you can see males have here lower than females, but then it goes higher for the most part. Okay, and continues on to today where it's higher. Okay. So we can think not only in terms of discrimination across races, but we can think of discrimination within races for other factors. This data here shows the occupational distribution in 2011, and we'll see that women tend to be represented in different occupations than men, disproportionately represented. For example, women are 47% of the employed labor force, but you'll notice that they make up 90+% of secretaries. They make up 90 or so % of registered nurses, very high fraction of elementary school teachers, waiters and waitresses, laundry workers. When you see a percentage for these occupations that is higher than that group's percentage in the population, there are factors that are influencing women into these occupations beyond just what we would expect. I mean, look, if women are half the employed labor force, then you would expect them to be represented in half of all occupations. But that's not the case. Some occupations are overrepresented in, and some occupations are underrepresented in. Brick masons are almost non-existent in terms of women. Taxi drivers, dentists, janitors, and cleaners, those types of things. African Americans are 11% of the employed labor force. And you'll notice that they're represented more heavily in industries like nursing aides and orderlies, laundry and dry cleaners, taxi cab drivers, and underrepresented in jobs like physicians and surgeons, brick masons, waiters and waitresses, elementary school teachers. Okay. Actually, these two, elementary school teachers and registered nurses, they're right at about their population percentage. So that's kind of what we would expect, right? If blacks are 11% of the population, then we would expect them to be around 11% of these occupations. So it's really these jobs that they're underrepresented in and these that they're overrepresented in. So you can think of not just differences in wages or differences in unemployment, you can also think of differences in the types of jobs that some people are doing and if they're over or underrepresented in those jobs. In other words, discrimination is a force that can cause wage differentials, unemployment differentials, and occupation differentials. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only influence on these factors. It's not, but it's one of them that we need to consider. Let's keep going. Educational attainment is a factor that intermixes with these wages, jobs, and unemployment rates. So certain groups have higher educational attainment than other groups. Take a look. Whites are more likely to have a college education than African Americans. For example, white males, the lighter bars show college education, 32% college educated, and this data is for 2014. White females around the same. Notice it's lower for black males and black females. Well, the lower educational attainment in college is going to be a factor contributing to those lower wages and higher unemployment and occupational choices that are made. In other words, we need to kind of control for educational attainment to understand what factor discrimination really is. Here's some data on earnings by race, education, and sex. It says full-time women and black workers earn less than white males at each educational level. You see that down here. Now this data is 2013, so don't rely on it too much, but the patterns will be similar today. In other words, white males generally will make more than white females, okay? And black males will make more than black females, and whites in general will make more than blacks. So it will fit with that pattern. And that's, for the most part, at every educational level. You can also see it here. This graph shows going from no high school diploma to high school diploma to associate's degree to bachelor's degree. And note that while each group witnesses an increase, whites and blacks by gender, the rate of increase is different for groups and the amount is different. For example, white males see an increase in their compensation, their annual earnings, by getting more education. But so do white females, so do black males, so do black females. But the rate of increase for white males seems to be higher than for some of these other groups. Also note that white males with every level of education make more than white females, black males, and black females. Okay. Again, there are other factors that come into play. Here, we're controlling for education. For example, someone with a bachelor's degree, if they're a white male, would make more than if you have these other groups. Now, is that difference a result of discrimination? Could be, but it could also be a result of other factors. For example, we would need to consider, do these other groups go into degree programs that are different and maybe less lucrative than the programs that the higher earning group goes into? For example, Asians don't show up here, but if we were to look at the types of bachelor's degrees that Asians get, they tend to be more science-oriented, more mathematically oriented, and they tend to pay more. Whereas the bachelor's degrees that whites go into tend to be more humanities-based and pay less. So if we did have Asian data here, we would see bachelor's degree Asians make more than white males, and that is in part a result of the types of degrees. So there's many factors that come into play here, and discrimination could be one of them. Considerations in analyzing the data. Non-discriminatory factors. Racial and gender differentials in earnings and employment data do not result solely from discrimination. race and gender are often correlated with non-discriminatory factors that cause lower wages and employment. The most notable, of course, is education, but there's other factors as well. Economic discrimination is a specific type of discrimination. It's where we say individuals are identical in the relevant characteristics to a job. They have the same abilities, the same education, the same training, the same experience, but they get inferior treatment due to a non-relevant characteristic. For example, being black or being female or being young or old. Again, discrimination is a broad spectrum that can affect a lot of different people. When you think of economic discrimination, think of two people that have exactly the same abilities to do the job. So from that standpoint, they shouldn't have different wages. They shouldn't have different unemployment rates. They shouldn't have different jobs, different job characteristics. But if you see that, then there's something else going on. And that's where we start to open the door to economic discrimination. Okay? But it would make sense that if, for example, a white male had more education than a black male, they would make more money. It would make sense that if an Asian had more experience than a non-Asian, they would make more money. And it would make sense if a black male had more training than a black female, the black male would make more. So you got to control for all those other non-discriminatory factors and get to what is irrelevant. If race is irrelevant, or gender is irrelevant, or age is irrelevant, then if there's discrimination in those four factors, we call it economic discrimination, and we say that that is a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that race and gender and age are never non-discriminatory factors. And this is really kind of counterintuitive, because if you ask the question generally, is discrimination a bad thing? Well, it's not. Discrimination is actually a good thing. You want an employer to discriminate based on training, based on education, based on your work ethic, based on your experience. You want discrimination in all the relevant factors, because what do? We go out and we work hard to get those relevant factors so that we can be discriminated against in a positive way. And we say, well, if I make more than somebody that doesn't get an education, then that's discrimination, right? But that's relevant discrimination because I'm more productive than they are. But if you look at a job and, the only meaningful kind of criteria is, let's say, education and experience, and two people are exactly the same in that respect, but one's black and one's white, and the black guy gets a lower wage than the white guy, well, if race is irrelevant, then that's a problem. Then that's irrelevant discrimination, and we would say that that's something that maybe needs to be countered, with policy or laws or things like that. But as I was saying, race and age and gender are not always irrelevant. For example, if the job is, let's say, for an actor, and the role they're going to play is a mafia hitman, like those mafia movies, well, getting a mafia hitman, you need an Italian male, right? I mean, if you want to make a movie about Al Capone, for example, the actor needs to be an Italian male. So you could discriminate based on gender. You say we're only going to hire males, and you could discriminate based on race. You could say we're only going to take, white people, white Italians. Another one is in regards to religion. So well, you can't discriminate based on religion. You can if it's relevant to the job. For example, it's reasonable for a church, a Catholic church that's hiring for a priest to only hire people that are Catholic. Right? So we always want to delineate between what is a relevant characteristic for the job and what is irrelevant. And if the employer is discriminating based on irrelevant characteristics, that is economic discrimination. And that is usually something that we want to counter. Not always, but oftentimes we do. And an example would be there are some groups that just don't have protections. Race is protected via the Civil Rights Act. Gender is protected. But obesity is not protected in most areas. So, you can discriminate. You say, well, I'm only going to hire somebody that's not obese. Okay, well, if being obese is relevant to the job, then that might be a non-discriminatory factor. But if it's not relevant to the job, which it usually wouldn't be, let's say you're hiring accountants and one accountant is 400 pounds and the other accountant is, slim. They're like 150 pounds. And you say, well, I'm not going to hire the heavy set accountant. Well, if the weight is irrelevant to doing the job of an accountant, which it probably is, then you would be engaging in economic discrimination. So keep that in mind when analyzing the discriminatory data. All right, guys, that's it.